More moves are coming as a report reveals a massive New York Rangers trade update. After just trading away Ryan Lindgren, Chris Drury is not done yet, and we have some insight into some of the names that could be making their way out of New York at this year's trade deadline. We're going to break it all down and more in this episode of Rangers Digest. But before we do that, a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. About 68% of you who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel, so if you want to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the New York Rangers, it's free. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. Now, obviously, more moves are on the way. We know this. Chris Drury has made up his mind. And I mean, we kind of knew whether they were in the playoffs or not. Well, I shouldn't say that. We kind of knew, because of the playoff race this year and what's happening, the circumstances, that the UFAs were going to be moved off of. And two already have been moved off of, and that's Ryan Lindgren and Jimmy Vesey. And in terms of that trade, very interesting. I think it's a pretty good return for the New York Rangers. And from Vince, getting a second-round pick for Ryan Lindgren was always the goal. But Parssinen is the other key piece the New York Rangers wanted. And honestly, I'm very excited to see what Parssinen can do in this Rangers lineup because, again, he's a big boy. He can be a bit of a hound on the puck. So I'm excited to see what he's going to be able to do at that third-line center role. And there's your third-line center that we've kind of been talking about the last couple of weeks as well. It's not, super flashy or anything like that, but they've obviously upgraded in a position that they thought they had to. So maybe not upgraded, but they added a piece, right? So there's your third-line center. It's seeming like right there. And the Rangers have been scouting him for a while and believe he can slot in at 3C. So it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic goes. And he's only 24, and they feel there's untapped potential with him. He'll be an RFA with arbitration rights this summer. So that's something we're going to have to continue to keep an eye on too, because that's going to be very tricky. Obviously, Ryan Lindgren was going through that last season. So very tricky there. And here's some thoughts from Matthew in terms of the breakdown of the trade. And again, we're going to get to who might be traded in just a second. I think it's pretty obvious at this point if you're looking at all the UFAs. But Parssinen is a 24-year-old center who's built like a tank, right? Like he's a big centerman, exactly what this front office has desired and what this team needs, to be honest. And the New York Rangers learned from the critical mistake of signing Girardi and Stahl. Drury saw an opportunity to move off of Lindgren and did exactly that. You know what? I said in my last video, thank you to Ryan Lindgren for everything that he did for the New York Rangers. It was time to move off the player. It really was. And, he was the warrior for this team, an absolute warrior. So, you can't forget how important he was to the team. But at the same time, this was the time to move off of him because of the circumstances. I thought the contract they signed him to was actually a really good one because it gave them this flexibility. If things went south like they did this year, they can move off of him. And if they were in the playoffs, great. They didn't sign him long-term or anything like that. It would have worked out fine. So, I think I have to give credit to Chris Drury on that one. He kind of maybe foresaw this coming. But anyway, this is from Snark Messier. And as well as Vince, we'll get to something in a second, but wouldn't be too surprised to see Chris Drury move on from Riley Smith now too. It seems imminent. I would imagine Riley Smith gets traded before Tuesday at this point. Like it's going to come down in the next couple days here. Riley Smith, there is no world, I believe, where Riley Smith is on this team past this year's trade deadline because, we're going to get to it later in the video. You got to start playing the young guys and we'll get to the young guys in a second too because they barely played last night. And there's a lot of, I think, conflicting reports and miscommunication between GM and coach, which is weird because you thought they were on the same wavelength, but nonetheless, we'll get to that in a second. But the New York Rangers are adamant on that they remain focused on making the playoffs, and this is from Vince Mercogliano. They want to make the playoffs still. This is not them selling per se. They're selling off pieces they're not confident they're going to re-sign. They want to get and recoup assets for them, but they still want to make the playoffs. But this trade also makes it clear that they aren't going to let pending UFAs walk for nothing. That feels like the right strategy in this moment. Riley Smith is likely the main piece they're still shopping. So even from Vince Mercogliano, he is saying Riley Smith will probably be moved ahead of this year's trade deadline, which I think was very interesting. Now, before we get into the young players, obviously they're moving off of UFAs at this point. They're bringing in some depth players too. So, if there is a trade for Riley Smith that just involves maybe draft picks, right? You have maybe a spot open on the roster. Well, you want to start calling up the young guys. This is the time to do it. You want to call up the Othmans like they just did, the Brett Berards, right? Brodzinski's been playing well the last couple of games. But one thing to keep in mind is last night against the Toronto Maple Leafs, Peter Laviolette does not like young players. Like that is obvious. We all know that at this point. That is not a specialty, young players. He's not that coach. He's not that guy. So Othman, Brodzinski, and Rempe all played the best game of their NHL career last game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, obviously, this is John. And sorry, I think this is actually referring to the New York Islanders game. But what he's saying here is they all received 7:31 time on ice or less against the Toronto Maple Leafs in their last game. So not a single other New York Ranger forward other than VC got less than 13-14. That is wild to me. That is wild. I know they're kind of fourth line players, depth players. That's a little wild. Othman should be playing a little bit more. I'm not sure what he's going to do with 7 minutes of ice time. Like, I really don't know. Especially if he knows he makes a mistake, he's going to be sitting. So that's something to keep in mind. Also have to give, props here to JT Miller for MVP because he did call the Ryan Lindgren trade almost, it was close. It was very close what he called there, except they got a couple players back in return and obviously got the team wrong, but very close. And he's predicting, Riley Smith is gone as well, 50% retained. Keep in mind, on top of all of this, the Rangers have a ton of cap space this year. I don't think they're going to go out and get a big fish. I think that they can retain salary to get some more assets. That is the way to do it. Then you can flip those assets or use obviously the draft picks if you want. So, very interesting there. I wonder what happens with Chris Kreider as well. Mika Zibanejad this summer. There's a lot that can still happen, ahead of this summer. So it's going to be very interesting. But yeah, I think they got to start playing the young guys more because you got to call them up. So this is from Peter Baugh. Right now, this is kind of what the new lineup would look like, the new additions in their next game. Cooley, Miller, Zibanejad. Big fan of Cooley, obviously. Got the jersey behind me. I think he's been playing great. Deserves to be on the first line. Panarin, Trocheck, Lafreniere. Lafreniere has been an issue too. We'll focus on that in a different video. Brzezinski, Parsonen, third line center, Riley Smith. I'd imagine he might be moved at some point too. Brett Berard maybe being called up. There's one other guy that I think is going to fill that spot, and I'll get to that in a second. Brendan Othman, Sam Carrick, and Matt Rempe. Then you got Miller, Borgen, Jones, Snyder, who, you know what, those two have been fantastic. Cover that in another video. And then you have Calvin DeHaan and Vakanainen down there in the third pairing, which I think is exactly where they should be. And obviously Fox would be in there if he was healthy. Now, we cannot forget there is one other guy, and obviously this is another mock lineup that we'll get to in a second, but we cannot forget that I believe Gabe Perreault is on the way this season. Once his season wraps up, he's going to make the jump to the NHL, and he's going to make the jump to pro next season, whether that is with the Rangers. Obviously, it depends how the summer goes and free agent signings and whatnot, but he's going to make the jump to pro next year, whether it's the AHL or the NHL. But this season, this guy's going to play for the New York Rangers this season. Like, once his season wraps up, he's going to make the jump to the NHL. So let's keep in mind when we're doing all these mock lineups and stuff like that, imagine Riley Smith, he's going to get traded. I would imagine he gets traded. There's no way they're going to keep him at this point. Gabe Perreault is going to come into the lineup and hopefully inject some more youth, some scoring into the lineup. We saw what he did at the World Juniors. He's having a fantastic year, as you can tell here. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly what they end up doing, but the move now is to, like, we've seen it. It's happening. It is actively happening. Obviously, Lindgren was just traded. Jimmy Vesey was just traded. It is actively going down. There are more moves coming. Riley Smith is next. If you are an UFA, you are next. I'll just say that. If you have an expiring contract and you play for the New York Rangers, you are next. You are being moved before next Friday. So again, just keep in mind they're going to move off these players and you have some youth coming up. But I am a little bit scared because of Peter Laviolette's coaching style, his tendencies, stuff like that, because it does not lend to the development of young players. So I'm a little bit worried about that. I wonder if he's the coach past this season because the Rangers are shifting directions to a little bit younger. I think that is the plan at this point. So it's going to be interesting to see how Gabe Perreault fares this season when he eventually does get called up. We'll cover that when that happens, but I think you maybe want to, kind of pencil in a spot for him in a little while, in a couple weeks from now. So we'll see how everything plays out, but I think one thing is for sure, more moves are coming, and I think it's Riley Smith that is going to be the guy. But let me know in the comments what you think about the trade that just happened, the fallout from the trade. Obviously, Ryan Lindgren no longer a New York Ranger. Calvin DeHaan's coming in. I'm very excited to see what some of the new players can do. So let me know what you think in the comments, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with everything New York Rangers.